Hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to YOSA's live chat with Mr. Cavazos today. We're super happy to have you all here. Mr. Cavazos, thanks for taking the time to join us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. How are you doing?
I'm hanging in there, doing well. So everybody, Mr. Cavazos is the conductor of YOSA Sinfonietta Strings and has been with us for 2 years as a YOSA conductor. Mr. Cavazos, we'd love to get to know you a little bit. How did you go on this journey? What brought you to the decision to become a musician? And then how did you become a professional musician?
Oh, wow. Okay, so I actually feel like I got a late start in my violin playing. I play violin, by the way. We didn't have, especially since I've been working in school districts that have orchestra starting in elementary school. I was in school in San Antonio ISD and we didn't offer that. We started in 6th grade and I actually didn't start until I was a 7th grader. Very quiet when I was a kid, very shy and timid. I didn't really speak up for myself. I was just kind of like, whatever, let things happen. And I remember going to electives night at the middle school when I was a 5th grader. Actually, I was a 3rd grader because this was when my brother was going into middle school. And they were talking about all the electives that they offered, and they said band, and I knew what band was, and I was like, nah, football games. I remember one time when I was a kid, we went to a football game. I guess it was homecoming, and they invited the elementary schools. And I remember this sounds like such a string player thing of me, but there was this giant like June bug flying around the lights, and I was terrified. I must have been like in 3rd grade. And I remember that being like, no, I don't want to do football games. There's bugs, it's outside, I don't like it. So then I heard of orchestra. And I was familiar with the violin because my cousin actually played violin and mariachi when I was a kid. So I knew what the violin was. And I guess for me, it was more of an aesthetic thing. I liked the fact that you could see with the manipulations on the instrument that the musician was making. From the bow arm to the left hand, you could see all the work that was being put into it. And I thought that looked really cool, especially when they were unified in an ensemble. So I heard of orchestra and I thought, well, let's do that. I want to learn how to play the violin. Of course, I never said anything. I was like in 3rd grade at that point, but it had always been in the back of my mind. My brother joined band in 6th grade. He only stayed until the end of the 1st semester. So he dropped it in December because it just wasn't his thing. So when I got to middle school, my parents were like, let's let you get acclimated to middle school first, because they didn't want it to be a thing where I joined and then was overwhelmed with the transition from elementary school to middle school. And then I would want to drop and have a bad experience. So I didn't do anything, or I was in art in 6th grade. 7th grade, joined orchestra, and I absolutely loved it. For me, I think the kind of aha moment in playing the instrument was not necessarily playing by myself, but when we started playing in parts. I remember the first day in orchestra where we played, like the cellos and the basses played something different, and the violins were playing something we started playing, and then they came in, and then the harmony. And it was just like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. Because I liked the fact that we were multiple people playing different things, and it came together and we unified. And that really spoke out to me. So that happened in 7th grade. And then my orchestra teacher back then would take us to symphony concerts all the time. About twice a month, she would take us. And I remember going to the symphony, and I asked her if you had to major in music to play in the symphony. And she said, well, most of them do. Most symphony players do, but you don't have to, because it's more a matter of how well are you playing. It just so happens that most people who get in are people who go off and major in this. And I said, well, I think I might want to do that. And she says, that's great, but it'd be also a really good idea to do education, to do music ed, because then you could keep playing, but then it's also part of your everyday life. And so that kind of stuck with me. And then I think it was like February of that first year of being in orchestra that I was like, I want to be an orchestra director. And when my students, I used to teach middle school, and when they would ask me, how did you get here? I'd be like, well, I joined orchestra and I loved it. So I kept signing up for it the following school year. And then I got to senior year and I was like, what am I going to do? I want to stay in orchestra. Okay, I guess I'll major in music. And then so I pretty much joined and it never stopped. I got to where I'm at. I still do orchestra, and that's just kind of been formative in building my identity as like I'm an orchestra person, and sometimes I even think that identity supersedes an identity as a violinist. Like moreover than the violin, I play an orchestra, and I feel like I identify with that more.
Now, you're the director at Alamo Heights High School right now, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And did you just finish your first year at Alamo Heights?
We did, I did. I just finished my first year. Yesterday was our last day of classes. Next week we will go on campus to collect things and clean up the room. But yes, we just finished our first year.
And how has that transition this year from middle school director to high school director? What was the I don't know, what was most exciting about that? What was most challenging about that?
The most exciting, well, I was teaching middle school for 6 school years. I started in Northside ISD, and then I taught for 5 years in Northeast ISD at Tejeda Middle School. And all the while I had private students. And I had quite a bit of high schoolers as my private students. And what was different about teaching older students was their, how can I say this? I guess they were a little bit more independent, and they didn't necessarily look for guidance as often from adults. If they had an idea of how to try it, they tended to just go ahead and try it and then seek guidance later. And I really liked that, because I was, sometimes for me, it could be like if I felt like motions were going a little bit slow, sometimes I had to remember like, oh, when I taught middle school, these are kids, and they're not, some of them are not even teenagers yet. And so having to slow things down and really scaffold stuff so they can understand what I was saying when I was teaching. So being able to go to older students who had more cognitive abilities was exciting for me. The challenge was kind of the same thing I was excited for, because I had to, it was almost a change of a frame of an idea. I had to change my framework of trusting them more and knowing that they have experienced enough and they are smart enough to do a lot of things by themselves. Whereas before I knew that my students were going to look for my guidance. So instead of waiting for them to look at me, I would just anticipate it and give them guidance before anything happened. And when coming to high school, they didn't necessarily need that. And so it was, that was the most challenging thing. And I was very open and honest with my students, like saying, hey, just letting you know, because sometimes I could see them like rolling their eyes, and I'd say, I used to teach 10-year-olds, like, so if you feel like I'm speaking to you as if you're a child or in your opinion, a toddler, whatever, just be mindful of that, like I'm not doing it to insult you. I'm doing it because that's the framework that I come from, and I'll make adjustments. And as the year went on, it got better. Once I learned to trust them more, the experience was a lot more enjoyable.
Well, and that's an experience that all teachers have, I think, of, even within I'm sure you experienced this at Tejeda, that even within a cohort, as you go from year to year, there can be shifts in the level or the group of personalities that you have. But especially when you go to a different place or you go to a different age group, or both, sometimes you have to retool and find your angle with that group of musicians.
Right.
And I think it's a good thing for students to be aware of that teachers are almost always trying to do their very best to find a way that works for you. And, so sometimes we appreciate those eye rolls, or sometimes we appreciate more just the, hey, I think we got this, the sort of verbal feedback, so we know can help kind of find the right spot, the right. We actually had a question come in today. We had a couple questions come in today, but the first one I wanted to mention was Anna Kempter asked about what your favorite memory was this year from YOSA Sinfonietta Strings. So when you think back over this season, what was your favorite moment in rehearsal, in performance, and or again, it could be more than one?
I think for me, just collectively, the students in Sinfonietta this year had a really unique energy where they were able to have a blend of being social and they were kind of hysterical at times, but all that never over prioritized making music and being, and so the rehearsal was never lacking. So it was really cool to have students who were just had the best balance of sense of humor and seriousness. And so just overall, there were several times where, and I love these types of rehearsals where I have my baton up and everyone, they get their instrument up and they're looking at me getting ready to go, and then we just collectively start laughing for whatever reason. And for me that's enjoyable because it's like I don't even know what, but the energy in the room is just so great and so lighthearted. And I really love that because that's the kind of those are the kinds of rehearsals where students leave and it's almost like, oh man, it's done. I don't want to leave. I want to come back. And then so yeah, that's been my best experience overall, and that was pretty consistent throughout the season.
I was really impressed with the programming that you did with that group of doing different arrangements of different movements from the Dvorak New World Symphony. So often for students at the level of Sinfonietta strings, you get the chance to play these cool arrangements of standard classical repertoire. And that's fun. I mean, we all grew up doing that. I remember really vividly falling in love with music by Beethoven and Tchaikovsky and all kinds of composers from arrangements like that when I was in 7th grade, 8th grade. But, you get these little smaller chunks. So to take a bunch of those arrangements and put them together as sort of a mini version of the symphony was really clever and creative. And I thought the students really did a great job of rising to the occasion and playing it.
That was one of my favorite performances. And that idea came from, I was watching this documentary about El Sistema in Venezuela. And one of the teachers was giving kind of a confessional. And he was saying that the fundamental of El Sistema is the belief that students at all level, when they're learning how to play, or I guess just young people in general, they can say, well, when I grow up, I can be a doctor, or when I grow up, I can be an attorney, or a teacher even. But when they're learning music, they say, I am currently a musician. And so with that in mind, that kind of is the basis of my educational philosophy of, I want to provide experiences where students can start to mold themselves. And even if they're 9, 10, 11, they feel I'm making music just the same way the symphony is, in a different level, but what we're doing is the same. And that was actually something that I had been thinking about doing for a while. Unfortunately, there's not an arrangement of the third movement. Otherwise, I would have loved to throw a third movement arrangement, although it made me think like, oh, I got to work on that. But fortunately, YOSA put me in a position where I was able to program like that. Because in the public schools, there might be only 3/4 of the class who will be interested in doing that. Other, I have more of a range of ability. But through our auditions with YOSA, we do a pretty good job, I think, of making sure that students are all on the same level. So when I saw like, oh my gosh, these kids can handle it, that had been like an idea I've had for like 2 or 3 years.
Well, and it's great, Eric. It's funny, you and I, in your time with YOSA, haven't talked about this, but 10 years ago, when I first arrived here, one of the first things we did was actually formalize the system where we said, okay, here are the core pieces of repertoire. We want every kid to grow up seeing arrangements of these pieces as they go through the system. And then when they get to Philharmonic, they'll play the full-on legit version. And in fact, one of those pieces was the New World Symphony. And we have not, in more recent years, we haven't been focusing as much on that cycle of repertoire. But when you program that, I thought to myself, there are musicians on stage right now who are very likely to play the full Dvorak New World Symphony 3, 4, 5 years down the road. And that's a really exciting thing. So that was cool. So another question that came in, David Escamilla asked about, he asked about who's the director of the orchestra summer camp. So I wanted to, I'll talk about that, and then I wanted to talk about summer camps in your experience too. So the YOSA Summer Symphony Camp this year will not be happening in person because of the pandemic. we have decided not to try and gather orchestras in person in July. The spaces we work in at St. Mary's Hall are not huge, and we just felt like we couldn't have appropriate, safe amounts of space and distance and to make it a thing that everybody would be comfortable with. So we're going online. And so right now, we only have a few directors confirmed for the camp. I know that Josh Prado is going to be conducting Orchestra X, and Annette Solano is going to be conducting one of our orchestras. And then we'll continue to engage more conductors if the enrollment, depending on what happens with enrollment. So if we have lots of young musicians and need lots of different levels of orchestras, then we'll hire more conductors for those different orchestras. But then who else gets involved depends on the numbers. And I know, Mr. Cavazos, you have been one of the directors of the orchestra camp out at UTSA. And tell me about, I know that that camp is also on hold this year and not going to be going online right now. But what does that camp mean to you? What are your goals with the UTSA Orchestra Camp?
Well, I went to Dr. Dowdy, who is the director of the orchestras there, I guess now it's 3 years ago. And I talked to him about starting an orchestra camp at UTSA, just because I felt that most prominent music programs in universities across the country have an orchestra camp. And it's something that I feel is a staple in recruitment and kind of building an identity of, hey, we have a strong music program here. And if we can advertise that to students as young as middle school, then we become known to them, or maybe even become an option to them when they're seniors in high school and might want to major in music. They can look back and think, I had good experiences by learning from the staff at UTSA. So I came, I went up to him, and I had currently at the time I had students at Tejeda who, before the orchestra camp at UTSA, there was a chamber music camp called Summer Music Institute. And what it was is it was a normal camp, but it was based on chamber music, and it teamed up with the piano department. And I had students who signed up, loves the camp, and they had a hard time making because a lot of students were not joining, or it was really difficult to make the chamber ensembles fit by ability by who was applying to go. So the camp doesn't exist anymore, and it went a couple of years without, and I always remembered students being so disappointed and parents reaching out to me like, do you know of anything else that we don't really necessarily want to invest in an overnight camp at another university? It would be awesome to have a day camp. So I reached out to him, and maybe that was, maybe I kind of bit myself or I shot myself in the foot there, because he was like, oh, would you help us start it?
Right.
And of course I was like, yeah, that sounds wonderful, because it was something that I believed in, and I thought that we should offer to the community of San Antonio. So yeah, we started 3 years ago, and our first year, we didn't know if we would make, but we had 40 students. And we had Dr. Pellegrino, who is a wonderful string educator. We had her on staff, and I taught one of the orchestras as well. And last year we added guitar to our camp, and we doubled to about 83 students. So it was just a really wonderful experience. One of the things that we offer is what is called Little Kids Rock. And so what we're doing is we teach everyone basic chord structures on the guitar and on the keyboard. And that's kind of like their elective. And at our finale, we play pop tunes, and we give them charts. It's not even sheet music. And so just like a lead sheet, and they're playing the chords along with the orchestra members who are playing the melody. So it really means a lot to me, because like I said, it's something that I want to see for UTSA, and it's something that I think is important. And I would love to see the orchestra program continue to grow. It's been so great so far, as I'm sure you've learned.
Right. Well, as some people may not know, that I just finished my first year conducting the UTSA Orchestra. And when I began in that position, of course, Dr. Dowdy and I spent a lot of time together talking about where things had come from and where things were going. And I remember really vividly, Erik, that one of the things he said to me was, well, you don't have to worry about the orchestra camp. Erik's got that covered. He's killing it with that. Right now things are on hold, like so many things, but you and I have to circle back and talk more about how that fits into the future of UTSA music, because you really have done a great job there. And you're a UTSA alum yourself, aren't you?
I am. I got my bachelor's degree at UTSA, and I also have my master's from UTSA.
That's very cool. Go Runners.
Oh yeah.
So we had another question that came out about, this is Sydney Silva asking about what your favorite composers, who your favorite composers are. And it doesn't have to be classical music. I'd be curious about your favorite classical composers, but I know that you also are somebody who's an aficionado of lots of different styles of music. So
Yeah.
tell us about your favorite composers and maybe your favorite musicians in general.
Sure. My favorite composer probably is Dvorak. I really enjoy how he was able to incorporate more of the folk music of where he was from, and kind of bring that to light. And more specifically, and we talked a little bit about the New World Symphony. That was one of the first pieces I heard when I went to a symphony in middle school. So I loved it. I was a total music nerd in middle school, and I had Finale Notepad, and my friends and I would listen to it, and we would put in the sheet music, because there was no IMSLP back then. So we were putting in the first movement. I had the first movement, my friend had the last movement. We were putting it in on Notefly. So Dvorak really kind of has formed kind of the musician I am today. But favorite musicians in general, gosh, I like a lot. And usually in the first day of rehearsal, I will tell my students, like, yes, I'm an orchestra director. Yes, I play violin. Yes, we use classical music, but I love music in general, whether it be country. There's George Strait. I grew up with that. I grew up with Selena. I grew up with, my mom was a really big fan of Mariah Carey, Celine Dion. So that's the kind of music that was around. Even so much as like oldies. There's some songs I remember before UIL, I was making a comment, or I was singing a song to my band director because we were taking for orchestra. He's like, that song came out in 1964. How do you know that? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. but yeah, just kind of like the greats. And then with modern music, I really like Dua Lipa right now. I'm a fan of her, and that Don't Start Now. This is a song that came out in late 2019. Man, that
thing slaps. The
oh,
bass
yeah.
line in that tune, the rhythm arrangement, all that sort of disco vibe is amazing.
It's really great, and I love that. It's a little bit nostalgic for music back in the day, and I really love that an artist was able to bring that to light, especially with the younger generation. By the way, there's a song I had a student in when I was at Tata. Her name was Georgia, and every time I said her name, I would sing Georgia. She never knew why. And so when she was an 8th grader, I said, okay, Gladys Knight, Midnight Train to Georgia. And everyone's like, what is that? So before the bell rang, I played it over our intercom, and the kids loved it. So I'm like, yes, we need to keep these artists alive, And I had at our last concert, the parent came up to me, and the parent was like, that's like our song now, Midnight Train to Georgia. Like, that's what we think. And she's like, I had no idea that my 13-year-old daughter would come home knowing that. And so she was like, thank you, because that's a special moment for our family now.
That's really cool. Yeah, I mean, I think, the reality is that the vast majority of classical musicians love lots of other kinds of music, just like the vast majority of country musicians don't just listen to country, and the vast majority of heavy metal musicians don't only listen to heavy metal. And I think sometimes some listeners and fans are surprised by that, but we're musicians. We like great music. And I remember really vividly actually talking to a friend of mine who was a rapper in Philadelphia in the 90s, who talked all the time about how much he loved Andrew Lloyd Webber and like 80s Broadway, and how much that surprised people. But he's like, I'm allowed to like more than one kind of music, right? And so when Hamilton finally came along, I thought, yeah, man, it's all coming together for you. So another question that came up was about violin. You mentioned you play violin. What drew you to that? Now, I know you also, like a lot of orchestra teachers, you have proficiency on viola and other string instruments. You're actually a very good violist. But what drew you to the violin as your primary instrument?
I guess for me, it was more that I hadn't really heard of the other instruments when, like I mentioned before, I was familiar with the violin because my cousin played in mariachi. I remember going to a performance of hers when I was really young, like first or second grade. And so when I heard that the violin was part of orchestra, at first thought in third grade when I heard of it was the violin was orchestra. And that's just what I thought. So I thought to be an orchestra, I had to play violin. And it's funny because my orchestra director, um, what she would do is she gave us like a choice sheet, and we'd have to put like 1, 2, or 3 for our top 3 instruments. And I put this is a testament to how quiet I was. I put violin number 1, viola number 2, and cello number 3. And when she handed out instruments, she gave me a viola. And it took me like 3 weeks to tell her I didn't ask. Viola was my number 2. I wanted violin. And she was like, what are you talking about? So I ended up switching after 3 weeks of learning the alto clef and viola back to violin because that's what I wanted. But it was just like, I guess because that's what I learned first, that really drew me to the instrument. And then once I got to it, I really liked how high it went. It was up in the stratosphere, and I liked that. Now so much, I feel like I'm a little bit more mellow, and I like that sound better. But my orchestra teacher was really encouraging to all of her students to learn multiple things. Like, she didn't teach us just our clef to read. When she was teaching us how to read music, she taught us all 3. And so once I got to college and I was meeting students who didn't know how to read all 3 clefs, I was like, I thought that was normal,
Right.
But yeah, so it was just the highness of the instrument, I think.
What's funny about that to me, Eric, is that you mentioned it was the only one you'd heard of. When I was going into 4th grade and I started on viola, I actually chose viola because it was the only one that I had not heard of.
Oh.
She held up the violin, and I'd heard of that. She held up the cello, and I'd heard of that. She showed a bass, and I'd heard of a bass. But viola, I was like, what is a viola? That's cool. I want to play the thing I've never heard of. So
Right.
kind of complimentary that way.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was always very happy not to have to go high. When I finally had to start shifting, I was not super happy about that. But I did it. I don't do it much anymore. But I always joke that when my daughter was born, I stopped practicing, which honestly is pretty much true. And she turned 16 last month, so
Oh,
David Escamilla has another question. Mr. Cavazos, you are from San Antonio.
yes.
And David was curious about whether you speak Spanish.
I don't speak Spanish. I know a little bit. When usually when I speak to native Spanish speakers, I tell them I probably can formulate sentences as well as a 2-year-old, where it's like there's tons of misconjugations or anything like that, but you can kind of get the gist of what I'm trying to say. Right. But no, unfortunately, I wish I did though.
You know some San Antonio Spanglish though. I've seen you throw around some puro San Antonio language.
Oh, of course, I got to show representation.
That's very cool. Well, so we're in this difficult time, right? And we're all doing our best to stay focused on keeping ourselves and our families healthy. But I know that for you, music is also a solace and a source of comfort. And I know that just because of conversations we've had, and also because you and we run into each other on social media. And I've seen moments on social media, like one of your singing opera videos and things like that, where you've done a great job of showing the way that music can bring joy and comfort into our lives in this difficult time. So I'm wondering if you could think about a recommendation of an album or a piece of music or something that you think young musicians should listen to that maybe they don't already know. What kind of great piece? We've mentioned the Dvorak New World Symphony. We've mentioned Midnight Train to Georgia. But think of something where you feel like, man, this would be a great piece of music for a teenage musician to spend some time with this summer.
For me, and if any of Alamo Heights students are watching, they would have learned this. For me, a piece by Tchaikovsky, and more particularly the 4th movement of Souvenir de Florence. For me, and the reason why they would know it is because I took an excerpt for their audition this year. But I think that piece is wonderful. I think it's beautifully composed. And that the fourth movement in particular, just even from the beginning, there's that rhythm, in the middle strings, and it's just so energetic, and it can really pump you up. And it's like by the end, it's like, it's almost like a sporting event. When you hear that last piece, you almost want to, get out of your seat and start clapping. Immediately, it's just a crowd pleaser. And I think that is a piece that with young musicians, I think a lot of them have never heard of.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's performed, I think probably it's performed quite a bit, I think. Even here in San Antonio, I've heard it performed like twice at orchestra concerts. But I think for young players, for teenagers, I think that's something that, it can give them that motivation, and it just can energize you. Also, that piece, and then Mahler 1, the first movement. The end of that first movement in the big triumphant brass, it just, like, I use that as kind of like a morning wake up right after Tina Turner's Proud Mary.
Nice. Well, and for people who don't know it, the Souvenir of Florence by Tchaikovsky is a sextet for strings, which is also kind of unusual. There are only a few famous sextets for strings. So it's 2 violins, 2 violas, 2 cellos, which is kind of neat compared to a normal string quartet, that you get more of the dark lower sounds because you have double cellos and double violas. And it's his memory of visiting the Italian city of Florence. And so you have this Russian man who's from a relatively cold climate, who spent a great vacation, a long vacation in Florence, and then writes this piece about remembering how much he loved that place and the energy of it. And so it's a piece that's full of gorgeous melodies, but also of just a lot of rhythmic energy and joy. It's a really special piece. And it's also really showy, like it's not easy to play. So it shows off what the fingers can do. Sometimes string orchestras play it too. So you have more than one person per part. That is a great piece. And I'm going to go on a soapbox about string sextets, because for me, Souvenir of Florence then points to the other 3 great string sextets, which are 2 by Brahms. Both Brahms string sextets are ridiculous. I mean, they're both just insanely great. And then Arnold Schoenberg wrote a piece called Transfigured Night. And that's kind of the toughest listen of these 4. But it's still really beautiful. It's not like crazy, weird, difficult music. It's just a big, long, romantic, gorgeous piece of music. It goes on for quite a while in one movement. But man, if you're, especially string players, spending time with those sextets of Brahms, Tchaikovsky, and Schoenberg, it'll teach you all kinds of new things about how strings can evoke emotions. And good pick, man. That's exciting stuff. I love it. And then, Mahler Symphony No. 1 is fine. That's good. That's good. One other question before we wrap up. Just speaking of this music that has been exciting, music that you love. Think back on your career as a performer. I'm wondering whether at UTSA or in some other kind of region orchestra or some other kind of community orchestra that you've played with. What's your peak performance moment in an orchestra? What was the thing you played that was the most thrilling in your life as a performer? Could be chamber music too, of course.
Sure. For me, this is kind of odd, but Aaron Copland's Billy the Kid Suite, that performance or that music has just really stuck with me. And I have no idea why. Even as far down to where, the strings are just pits and the trumpet has a solo. Even the trumpet solo, it stuck with me. And probably because it was a little bit different. I played it when I was 20 years old, and I was in the community orchestra at UIW under Terry Frazier.
Yep.
And at that time, I was considering going to Texas State or UTSA, thinking of transferring at the time. And when I was performing that, I was in this particular moment in my life where I was kind of thinking about where I wanted to go and trying to come up with steps that can take me there. And I think more so that piece was the last piece we played for the season. And that was the last concert I played that year. And so I think it was just a culmination of where I was in life. And so hearing the music kind of tie into what I was going through and then moving past that, I think for me, that was that's why it kind of really stuck with me, and I love that piece. I still listen to it. And also another piece that I don't hear very often, and I would love for there to be an arrangement for intermediate orchestra. I would love that.
Yeah, I have a really formative memory with Billy the Kid too, actually. That was a big piece for me when I was 20 years old. I went on tour with the Philadelphia Youth Orchestra in Germany, and I was about to become their assistant conductor. I was a college student, and I had just, I was sort of next in line to become their assistant conductor. And I went on this tour and just lived with that piece over and over again, the way you do on tour. And man, it just, so many remarkable performances and memorable nights where we played that piece. And I just thought, man, I love this music. So yeah, well, I love it, man. I love that you have such a powerful relationship with the music you love. I'm grateful for all the great work you do at YOSA and all the great work you do throughout our community at Alamo Heights and at UTSA and everywhere at helping change kids' lives through music. So thank you for all of that. For everybody who's watching today, many of you know we've been cycling through talking to different YOSA conductors over the last month and a half. And we've had such a good time that we're actually going to continue having a Sunday conversation every week going forward through the end of July. But starting next week, we're going to start to have guests from outside of YOSA. And so the whole lineup will be announced this week. But I wanted to mention that our first guest next Sunday at 3:30 p.m. will be Pulitzer Prize-winning composer Jennifer Higdon. Jennifer is one of the most exciting orchestral composers alive today and has written just tremendous, amazing music. And she's also just a really kind and sweet person. And so it'll be great for us to have the chance to chat next Sunday at 3:30. And then I also wanted to mention, of course, that today, on May 17th at 6 p.m., we are going to be streaming the virtual YOSA Palooza. YOSA Palooza is a big combined YOSA concert that we end the season with every year. And this year, unfortunately, we weren't able to be together in person, but we're going to have a virtual YOSA Palooza on Facebook Live starting at 6 p.m. You can catch it live at 6, and you can also circle back later and watch the video afterwards if you would like. So please join us for that and more. And Mr. Cavazos, thanks one more time for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. And thanks to everybody else.